Hey, welcome to my podcast where I discuss the origins of all sorts of things. I'm your host, Danny Payne, and this is On the Origin of Everything. Today I'm talking about cowboys. Lots of songs about cowboys ran across my mind while working on this, and the one that got stuck in my head was, where have all the cowboys gone? Remember that one? But what we want to know is, where did all the cowboys come from? So saddle up, partner. Let's get started. So who were the first cowboys? I think you'll be very surprised to learn, as I was, that the first cowboys originated in Spain. Vaqueros, or the American pronunciation, vaqueros. Before we jump into this, just real quick. Vaquero comes from the word vaca, meaning cow, and the suffix ero, applied to a noun, turns it into a function, like someone who works with cows. Another example would be zapato, shoe, zapatero, shoemaker, or cobbler. I realized while working on this that sombrero is actually another example. The noun in sombrero is sombra, which means shade. A sombrero is a shade maker. And how about caballero? It translates into English as gentleman, but caballero comes from the word caballo, horse. So caballero would be someone who works with horses, not a gentleman. And where did gentleman come from? Gentleman? That turned out to be a whole thing that I'm not going to get into because that's not what we're talking about today, but still, very interesting stuff. Okay, anyway, cowboys come from Spain. Spanish vaqueros, I'm just going to use the English pronunciation to not be obnoxious. Spanish vaqueros were expert horsemen that herded cattle with lassos during the Middle Ages. They've even found horse spurs dating back to the 5th century BCE with the Celts. So obviously we've been using horses to herd cattle for centuries, but neither Celtic horsemen or medieval vaqueros represent the American Wild West cowboy we're all picturing in our minds right now. So let's bridge that gap. During the early colonial period, the Spaniards arrived in what is now Mexico, and they trained the native men to wrangle cattle on horseback like they did. Another quick side note, Europeans were actually reintroducing the horse to the Americas. The horse had evolved in North America from this little dog-sized herbivore some 50 million years ago, but around 10,000 years ago they vanished, extinct. Columbus and other European settlers reintroduced them to this continent. I just thought that was strange, and worth mentioning. But back to our timeline, like I said, the Spanish taught the natives how to be vaqueros, and the tradition of horsemanship spread over the next 200 years from present-day Mexico to Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico through Spanish colonial expansion. Spanish missions and vaqueros were closely related, basically synonymous. In case you don't know what a mission is, I'll tell you. The Spanish wanted to spread Catholicism everywhere they went while they were colonizing, right? Well, missions were communities that forced indigenous people to assimilate to Catholicism. So the first vaqueros in North America were actually natives under the rule of these Spanish missions. Quite a few of these missions are still around if you want to check them out. California has a ton of them. In 1821, Mexico gained its independence from Spain. Around that time, white Americans were moving to Mexico, the part that is now Texas. They were moving there for various reasons: cheap land, evading debt, evading taxes, and they established cotton farms and cattle ranches, and they brought their African slaves with them. By 1860, slaves made up 30% of the Texan population. In 1861, Texas joined the Confederacy, and while ranchers left their cattle ranches to fight in the Civil War, they depended on their slaves to do the cattle herding. This led to a bunch of black cowboys. They started out as slaves, but when the Civil War ended, the Emancipation Proclamation left white ranchers in a situation where they had lost all their slave labor and couldn't manage the cattle. Wild cattle outnumbered humans 7-1 in Texas at that time. They desperately needed cowboys to round up the rogue cattle, and were compelled to hire the now free and very skilled black men as paid cowhands. Being a cowboy was one of the few jobs a freed, previously enslaved cowboy could get. To be fair, not all cowboys at the time were black, but 1 in 4 were, and that's a lot more than I would have ever expected, and I'm willing to bet you're surprised too. We just never hear about black cowboys. Now, why were cattle so important that we needed so many and so many cowboys to manage them? The answer is simply beef. Beef was incredibly important during the Civil War. The demand reached an all-time high by the end of it. This meant we needed to push westward and establish more cattle ranches. More cattle ranches meant more cowboys. In 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad was completed, connecting the country east to west, coast to coast. Cowboys rounded up cattle that were then put up for sale and transported by rail across the country. The beef industry was booming. It was also the heyday of cowboys, but then something came along that decimated the cowboy profession, a simple invention called barbed wire. First patented in 1867, by the 1890s, that stuff was everywhere. It was like how self-checkout put thousands of cashiers out of work. It was the end of an era. The American cowboy became largely obsolete. So where did the iconic Wild West white cowboy come from? So far we've had Spaniard vaqueros, Native American horsemen, African American cowboys, but no heroic, quick-draw, tough guy, loner, riding his horse, sleeping on the dirt by a fire. If you handed him a guitar, he'd sing you a sad song about his dog and his dark past. Well, this image of the American cowboy started with dime novels. Between 1860 and 1920, cheap little paperback novels, which sold for a nickel or a dime, told fictional stories about the wild frontier. Common stories depicted white cowboys as the heroes, the protagonists. There were hundreds of dime novels written about a well-known figure of the frontier, one William Cody, or Bill Cody, who most people know as Buffalo Bill. He had gained notoriety out west as an army scout, a Pony Express rider, an Indian fighter, and a gold miner, all before his 14th birthday. In 1872, when the Duke of Russia wanted to do a hunting expedition out west, Bill Cody was one of his scouts, which received a lot of press. Buffalo Bill Cody was a perfect choice for a dime novel character. These stories embellished true events in Bill Cody's life. Now, I should add the disclaimer that a lot of these claims about his youth are hard to verify. Was he actually a rider for the Pony Express, or did he just work there? But I suppose the lore surrounding him is what matters. It sold a lot of dime novels. Fast forward 100 years and they named a freaking football team after the guy. I actually went to Bill Cody's grave last year. It's just west of Denver. If you want to see photos of that, you can go to ontheoriginpod.com. You can also see other photos and illustrations of today's topics there. Anyway, when the open range era ended because of barbed wire, Bill Cody started doing stage shows and eventually started the Buffalo Bill Wild West Show. This was a touring show that continued to paint the white American frontiersman as the hero. Many of the plots were about the wars between white settlers and the uncivilized Indians. Even the regularly performed Custer's Last Fight, where Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull killed Custer and all his men in the Battle of the Little Bighorn, only served to demonstrate, to sell the idea, that American conquest was justified. Dime novels and the Buffalo Bill Wild West Show basically invented the white heroic cowboy. And man, they took this show all over the place, even Europe, so it was pretty influential. Interestingly, black cowboys were well represented in Bill Cody's shows at first, for the first decade even. But as the image of the white cowboy grew in popularity, black cowboys all but disappeared. Then came westerns. The conflict between white pioneers and Indian tribes was also the general theme of westerns. As one of the most popular genres in early film, westerns continued to perpetuate the popular myth of the cowboy as the single white, good-looking hero of the story. Westerns were popular from the early to mid-1900s, so for about 50 years or so. That's 50 more years of hammering home that iconic image of the white cowboy. And have you ever heard of Wyatt Earp? He was a prominent lawman in the Wild West, and he lived to be 80 years old. When he retired, he moved to LA and became an advisor on the sets of silent Western films. Not to spell it out for you, but if your main reference for what the Wild West was like is coming from a retired white lawman, and you're also building off of Buffalo Bill's depiction of things, you're going to produce a very one-sided, skewed depiction of life on the frontier for your Western films. As white cowboy fandom grew, the vaquero was transformed into the racialized, vilified character, scripted as either the antagonist or one of the background characters. I mean, it's not super surprising considering the era, the audiences, the general sentiments toward marginalized groups at the time. It's gross to talk about, but it happened. I still find the significance of the American cowboy inspiring though, a trade that played such a crucial role in westward expansion. It was a big part of our Sea to Shining Sea story. and it's important to recognize Native Americans and Black Americans as having been a part of that history. That's the origin story of the American cowboy. In short, the first cowboys were in medieval Spain. Spanish colonizers trained natives to be cowboys. Then white ranchers had their African American slaves do their cowboying. Then barbed wire killed the cowboy trade, and the fictitious version of the white cowboy was born. And we have dime novels, Bill Cody, and Hollywood to thank for that. Stick around for a handful of origins right after this. This show is brought to you by nothing. If you'd like to help keep ads off of this show, click the Patreon link in the show notes to donate, or visit patreon.com/ontheoriginofeverything. Another way you can support this show is by giving it a 5-star rating and review, or by following it or sharing it. Let's build a community of people that are curious and always learning. Now, back to the show. Part 2 of this episode is on a couple of iconic cowboy accessories. First, their horse, because I wanted to know what kinds of horses early cowboys were riding, and I had totally forgotten that Mustangs existed. They rode Mustangs, right? Well, sort of. Like I mentioned in part 1, horses were being reintroduced to the Americas by colonists, and the horses that they brought over were colonial Spanish horses, a breed that descended from the Iberian horse. Iberian horses are one of the oldest domesticated horse breeds. They're big and strong, but elegant. The Iberian horse breed led to the colonial Spanish horse, and that's the horse that was brought to the Americas in the 16th and 17th centuries. The escaped ones of those colonial Spanish horses are the ancestors of the wild Mustangs. I suppose wild Mustang is redundant, as a Mustang is wild by definition. In the 1600s in colonial America, English thoroughbreds were crossbred with Mustangs to produce the American quarter horse. This is the horse that cowboys were riding. They're called quarter horses because they could outpace other breeds in a quarter-mile race. They were compact and muscular, able to provide a burst of speed. They had a good-natured disposition, making them easy to handle and train to be used for a variety of tasks, ideal for farming, cattle herding, and frontier living. To get more specific, the quarter horse breed began around the 1660s, about 100 years before the signing of the Declaration of Independence, for some context. I love horses, man. They're so powerful and majestic. Each one has their own personality. They're social and smart. I also love how historically impactful they've been. Cowboys and horses are inseparable. Nothing would have gotten done without horses. No westward expansion, no cattle drives, no beef industry, certainly no Pony Express, and no rodeos, which is what I want to touch on next. So, you know how many Olympic sports are derived from trades or occupations, like archery, sailing, fencing, and dressage? The rodeo is the sporting event derived from cowboy skills. Before rodeos were proper events at county fairs, these cowboy competitions took place in cow towns, which were the places at the end of cattle driving trails that served as market centers or shipping points for cattle. A bunch of rugged dudes in one place trying to outdo each other for bragging rights makes the most sense in the world to me. This is how rodeos got started. Cowboys measuring each other up on riding and roping skills. When barbed wire put an abrupt end to the open range era, these competitions shifted to a more formal, entertaining event for spectators, just like Bill Cody shifted from cowboy stuff to doing stage shows. Learning this made me appreciate the rodeo a lot more. It's an American cowboy tradition. Pretty cool. It's worth mentioning that rodeos aren't exclusively found in the United States. Since Spain colonized most of the Americas, it makes sense that rodeo-like events developed throughout Mexico, Central and South America, and beyond. The word rodeo comes from the Spanish word rodear, meaning to encircle or to round up. Even the terminology points back to the Spanish-Mexican antecedents of the American cowboy. Incredible stuff, man. Let's wrap it up with another iconic cowboy accessory, the cowboy hat. Ever wonder where the cowboy hat came from? It's a pretty specific look. People have been riding horses for ages, and they weren't wearing cowboy hats until pretty recently. In the early days of westward expansion, frontiersmen were wearing bowler hats and coonskin caps, not cowboy hats by any means. Now, if you look this up, a lot of sources will say that the predecessor of the cowboy hat is the sombrero, but there's no direct connection between sombreros and cowboy hats. Sombreros first appeared in the 15th century in Spain, and Spanish colonizers brought them over to the Americas. they've always been broad-brimmed hats with tall crowns, originally worn for protection by peasants and horsemen who worked outside in the elements. Vaqueros were wearing these too. The cowboy hat has its own origin story, unrelated to the sombrero. John B. Stetson created the modern cowboy hat in 1865. Can you guess which state? I would not have guessed Pennsylvania. I would have guessed Texas, probably. John B. Stetson was actually from New Jersey, and later manufactured cowboy hats out of his factory in Philly. What business did Stetson have inventing the iconic cowboy hat? Well, having grown up as the son of a hat maker, he had some business. Story time. One day, Stetson came down with tuberculosis and was told he didn't have long to live. So he quit the family hat-making business and traveled out west to see the frontier before he died. And while out there in Colorado, out of pure utility, he made a felt hat for himself. Making felt out of animal furs was something he had done his whole life. And though his practical design looked unusual to other frontiersmen, someone liked the functionality of it so much that they offered him a $5 gold piece for it. That's like $100 today. That was technically the first Stetson hat ever sold. What made his prototype so unique was the broad brim and its waterproof quality. Felt is made of fur or wool, whereas leather is made of hide. We all know that leather can deteriorate over time if it gets wet, unless it's treated to be waterproof. Stetson's felt hat performed much better in the elements than the leather hats that were around, and certainly better than the bowler hats everyone was wearing. Stetson recovered from tuberculosis, got his health back, and moved back to Philly to start his own hat company in 1865. He didn't have much success in the East, but out west, his new frontier-inspired hat that he marketed as the Boss of the Plains did very well. He received so many orders from dealers that he had to build a huge factory in Philly. So yes, the most famous cowboy hat brand ever came out of Philadelphia, of all places. And what did they look like? His design was pretty simple. A wide, flat brim, not curved, and a high, straight-sided crown. Sounds a lot like the description of a sombrero, but if you look both of them up, they're different. Once the consumer got a hold of Stetson's Boss of the Plains, they would shape and mold it to suit their needs. Some would bend the brim upward on one side to avoid contact with their whip. The creased crown had its own function for gripping the hat. Over time, the bends and creases were a sign of where you were from or what type of work you did. They eventually became more fashion-forward too, making a statement about one's lifestyle, country living, cattle ranching, and farm life, while also serving their original intended purpose of keeping a cowboy's head cool and dry. Have you ever seen someone dressed head to toe in Western attire in an unexpected place? One time I saw a guy in cowboy boots, dark blue jeans, a long-sleeved snap-button plaid shirt, and a big old cowboy hat in a Macy's, in a mall, in Seattle. That's all for today, though that was quite the robust episode. We covered a lot of ground. I hope you enjoyed learning all about cowboys and their faithful quarter-horse companions and their trusty Stetson hats. If you find yourself at a rodeo, as one does, I hope you'll remember the history and the rich traditions you learned about in this episode. Until next time, happy trails. Research, music, and production was all done by Jezere Wilson. This podcast is listener-supported, owned and operated by Jez and myself under the On the Origin of Everything LLC in the United States, all rights reserved. We can be reached via email at info@ontheoriginpod.com.